The $1 forbidden additive. Why big oil? Buried. This 1968 discovery. The invisible thief. Every time you fill your tank, you're paying for something you will never fully receive. Nearly 40% of the fuel you purchase, almost half of every liter, is converted not into motion, but into heat. It exits your exhaust pipe as wasted energy, and you never get it back. This has been happening for over a century, and almost no one knows. The internal combustion engine, the technology powering over 1.4 billion vehicles on this planet, operates at a thermal efficiency of barely 60%. That means for every 10 units of energy you buy at the pump, only 6 actually reach your wheels. The remaining 4 vanish into the atmosphere as heat. This is not a malfunction. This is how the engine was designed, and more importantly, how the industry has chosen to keep it. This inefficiency is not an accident of physics. It is a consequence of economics. For the oil industry, an inefficient engine is not a problem to be solved. It is a customer to be maintained. A vehicle that burns 40% less fuel means 40% less revenue. Across a $1 trillion global market, that is an existential threat. So the question was never whether the engine could be made more efficient. The real question, asked behind closed doors, was how to make sure it never had to be. The global fuel market generates approximately $3.5 trillion in annual revenue. Of that staggering sum, over $1.4 trillion every single year is revenue derived from fuel that produces absolutely zero motion. It is money paid for combustion that serves no purpose other than to generate heat and demand for the next tank. If every car on Earth suddenly became 40% more efficient, that revenue would collapse overnight. The oil tankers, the refineries, the petrol stations, the entire downstream infrastructure, all of it would be worth a fraction of its current value. Efficiency in this industry is not an innovation. It is an existential threat. Now consider what this means for you personally. The average driver spends somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 on fuel over a lifetime of driving. Apply the 40% waste figure, and the arithmetic is brutal. Between $25,000 and $40,000 of that money was spent on fuel that never moved your vehicle a single inch. It went into your engine, turned into heat, and disappeared. No refund, no acknowledgement, just a quiet, lifelong extraction, hidden in plain sight at every petrol station you have ever visited. But in 1968, in a research laboratory in California, an engineer made a discovery so significant and so dangerous to the established order that it was buried for over 50 years. What he found could have changed every engine on Earth. What happened next is the subject of what comes next. The Tulsa discovery. The year was 1968. While the rest of the world was consumed by the space race, political upheaval, and the roar of a changing century, a quiet and methodical scientist named Dr. Robert Henkel was working alone in a research facility in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was not employed by an oil company. He had no allegiance to the fuel industry. He worked for an aerospace engineering firm whose only concern was making aircraft engines perform better, run cleaner, and last longer. That distance from the oil industry, that independence, is precisely what made what he discovered so dangerous. Dr. Henkel had been given a straightforward mission: find a fuel formulation that could improve the combustion efficiency of high-performance aircraft engines. The aerospace industry had a problem that the automotive world largely ignored. At extreme altitudes and temperatures, standard jet fuel burned inconsistently, left carbon deposits on critical engine components, and wasted a significant portion of its energy as heat rather than thrust. His task was to solve that problem. What he found instead was something far larger than anyone had anticipated. Over the course of 18 months, Dr. Henkel systematically tested more than 200 chemical compounds and fuel additives. Each one was introduced into a controlled engine environment, measured for combustion efficiency, exhaust temperature, carbon output, and power generation. Most produced negligible results. Some made things marginally worse. And then, after compound number 207, everything changed. The compound was acetone, a simple, inexpensive, and widely available chemical most people associate with nail polish remover. On its own, acetone had been observed before in fuel research, and its effects were considered modest at best. But Dr. Henkel was not using acetone alone. He had combined it with a specific proprietary catalyst, a chemical activator that altered the way acetone interacted with the fuel mixture at the molecular level. The result was a combustion event that bore almost no resemblance to what the same engine had been producing the week before. The efficiency numbers that came back from the instrumentation were so far outside the expected range that Dr. Henkel assumed the equipment had malfunctioned. He recalibrated. He ran the test again, and then again. Each time, the results were identical. The acetone catalyst combination had pushed the engine's thermal efficiency from a baseline of 35% up to between 40% and 42%, a gain of 7 percentage points in a field where engineers celebrated improvements of half a percentage point. In the language of combustion science, this was not an incremental improvement. It was a rupture in the established order. But the numbers alone did not fully capture what was happening inside the engine. The exhaust temperature had dropped significantly, meaning that far less energy was escaping as wasted heat. The carbon deposits that normally accumulated on the cylinder walls and fuel injectors, the slow corrosion that degrades engine performance over time, had virtually disappeared. The combustion was cleaner, more complete, and more controlled than anything the standard fuel formulation had ever produced. And perhaps most remarkably, the engine was generating more power while consuming less fuel to do so. Every metric pointed in the same direction. This compound was not just improving the engine. It was fundamentally changing the nature of how fuel burned inside it. Dr. Henkel spent the following weeks documenting everything with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he had found. He was an aerospace engineer, not a political animal. He did not immediately grasp the commercial implications. What he understood was the science, and the science was telling him something extraordinary. A simple, inexpensive additive, available to anyone, could transform the efficiency of any internal combustion engine by a margin that the entire automotive industry had failed to achieve across decades of research and billions of dollars of investment. And then the realization arrived, gradually at first, and then with full force. He had been tasked with solving a problem for aircraft engines. But the internal combustion engine in an aircraft and the internal combustion engine in a family car operate on the same fundamental principles. The same chemistry, the same thermodynamics, the same inefficiencies. What he had discovered in a controlled aerospace laboratory in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was not a specialized solution for a niche industry. It was a universal one. Every car, every truck, every bus, every motorcycle running on a combustion engine anywhere in the world could, in principle, be made dramatically more efficient using an additive that cost almost nothing to produce. Dr. Henkel understood that he was no longer sitting on a technical report. He was sitting on a revolution. And within months of that realization, forces far more powerful than he had ever encountered would begin to make sure that revolution never arrived. The corporate assassination. When Dr. Robert Henkel filed his patent application in 1971, he believed, as most honest scientists do, that the system would protect him. He had the data. He had the documentation. He had 18 months of controlled laboratory results that no credible researcher could dispute. What he did not have, and what he fatally underestimated, was an understanding of how power operates when it feels genuinely threatened. The patent review process, under normal circumstances, takes between 12 and 18 months. Dr. Henkel's application sat in review for 14 months. What happened during those 14 months only became partially visible years later through documents obtained under Freedom of Information requests and the testimonies of former patent office employees who spoke on condition of anonymity. Within weeks of the application being logged in the public record, the legal departments of at least 3 of the world's largest oil companies had obtained copies of the formula. Not summaries, not abstracts. The full technical specification, including the precise ratio of acetone to catalyst and the controlled combustion conditions under which the efficiency gains had been recorded. They had everything they needed, and they did not sit still. Over the following year, teams of corporate lawyers and technical consultants worked in parallel, not to disprove the science, because the science was sound, but to find the administrative mechanism by which the patent could be denied. They found it. The rejection, when it came, was not based on any challenge to Dr. Henkel's results or his methodology. It was issued on a procedural technicality related to the classification of the catalyst compound. A bureaucratic ruling so narrow and so obscure that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The science was never questioned. The patent was simply closed. Dr. Henkel appealed. Of course he did. He was a man who believed in evidence and process, in the institutional structures that were supposed to protect inventors and reward genuine discovery. What followed was 6 years of litigation, 6 years of his own savings, his time, his health, and his reputation, consumed by a legal system that was not designed for an individual fighting 3 of the most capitalized corporations on Earth. Each appeal was met with a counterfiling. Each counterfiling introduced new procedural complications. Each complication cost money and months. The corporations were not trying to win arguments, they were trying to exhaust him. And eventually, in 1977, they succeeded. The final appeal was dismissed. Dr. Henkel, financially depleted and professionally marginalized, had no path left to pursue. But what happened next was perhaps more sophisticated than a simple legal defeat. The formula was not banned. It was not recalled or declared unsafe. No government agency issued any ruling against it. Instead, it was buried, quietly, methodically, and with remarkable precision. Inside the vast archive of rejected and lapsed patent records, a graveyard of ideas so large and so poorly indexed that finding anything within it requires knowing exactly what you're looking for. The oil companies had understood something that most people miss entirely. You do not need to destroy a dangerous idea. You only need to make it unfindable. A formula that exists on paper but cannot be located, verified, or commercially developed is, for all practical purposes, a formula that does not exist. Dr. Hankel spent the years that followed in a kind of professional exile. The aerospace firm he had worked for had quietly distanced itself from his research once the legal battles began. No university offered him a platform. No scientific journal published his findings. He gave occasional interviews to small technical publications, but his name had been successfully detached from any association with credibility in the mainstream scientific community, not through any direct attack on his character, but through the more effective method of simple institutional silence. When no one of standing engages with your work, the work ceases to exist in any meaningful public sense. In 1984, he gave what would be his last recorded interview to a small engineering newsletter in Oklahoma. The interviewer asked him directly whether the oil companies had stolen his formula. His answer has been quoted in fragments ever since, but the full sentence deserves to be heard in its entirety. He said, "They did not steal my formula. Stealing would have been cleaner. What they did was ensure that no one could ever use it. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Because one of those things is a crime and the other one is just business." Dr. Robert Hankel died in 1993 at the age of 71. His research notes, his laboratory documentation, and the original test data from the Tulsa facility were never formally published. His estate was modest. His obituary appeared in one local newspaper. And the formula, the acetone catalyst combination that had pushed combustion efficiency beyond anything the automotive industry had publicly acknowledged, went with him, or so it appeared, the physics of profit. To understand why Dr. Hankel's discovery worked, you have to understand why standard petrol does not work as well as it should. When fuel sits inside a tank or travels through a fuel line, its molecules do not remain evenly distributed. They cluster. Due to the surface tension inherent in hydrocarbon compounds, petrol molecules group together into dense molecular formations before they ever reach the combustion chamber. When these clusters ignite, only the outermost molecules combust cleanly. The molecules on the inside of each cluster burn partially, or do not burn at all. They pass through the engine as unburned hydrocarbons, wasted fuel, wasted energy, and a primary source of the black exhaust carbon that accumulates inside your engine over time. This is not a mechanical failure. It is a chemical one, and it happens inside every standard combustion engine on Earth at every single ignition event. Acetone disrupts this process at the molecular level. It is a compound with an unusually low surface tension, and when introduced into a fuel mixture in precise concentrations, it functions as a dispersant, breaking apart the molecular clusters that form in standard petrol and redistributing the fuel molecules more evenly throughout the mixture. The result is a combustion event in which a significantly higher proportion of the fuel actually ignites. More complete combustion means more energy released per liter, lower exhaust temperatures, less unburned residue, and a cleaner engine interior. The physics are not complicated. What is complicated is acknowledging that this has been understood for decades while the standard fuel formulation has remained unchanged. The knowledge has not disappeared entirely. It has simply migrated to the places where performance matters more than profit margins. Formula One racing teams operate in an environment where a single percentage point of efficiency can determine the outcome of a championship, and the combustion chemistry used in their engines reflects a depth of understanding that bears almost no resemblance to what powers the average road vehicle. While the specific compounds and formulations used at that level are proprietary and closely guarded, the underlying principle, that fuel atomization and molecular dispersion directly determine combustion efficiency, is precisely what Dr. Hankel documented in Tulsa in 1968. The science did not vanish. It was absorbed by industries that could afford to use it quietly without making it available to the general public. Military aviation presents an even clearer example. High-performance aircraft engines operated by defense forces around the world are fueled with formulations that are classified in their full specificity, but are publicly known to include combustion-enhancing additives that dramatically improve burn efficiency at altitude. The reasoning given is operational. Greater range, reduced refueling requirements, lower thermal signatures. The technology is real, it is proven, and it is funded by public money while being kept entirely outside the civilian fuel supply. The same principle that could reduce your fuel costs by a third is considered a national security asset when applied to a military aircraft. The long-haul trucking industry occupies a more interesting middle ground. Fleet operators, the companies running hundreds or thousands of diesel trucks across continental distances, live and die by fuel efficiency in a way that the individual motorist does not. A 1% improvement in fuel economy across a large fleet translates into millions of dollars annually. As a result, fleet managers at the largest logistics companies have, for decades, employed fuel treatment programs that include acetone-based additives among other compounds. This is not secret in the industrial sense. It is documented in procurement records and fleet management literature. It is simply never discussed in the context of the ordinary consumer, because the ordinary consumer is not the customer the fuel industry is trying to retain. The fleet managers know, the fuel industry knows they know, and a quiet, mutually understood arrangement has persisted in which this knowledge remains inside the walls of the commercial logistics sector and goes no further. The carbon economy extends the story further. Incomplete combustion does not merely waste fuel, it deposits residue. Every partial burn leaves behind carbon compounds that accumulate on cylinder walls, fuel injectors, intake valves, and exhaust components. This accumulation gradually degrades engine performance, increases fuel consumption, and eventually necessitates mechanical intervention. The entire ecosystem of engine cleaning services, carbon flush treatments, injector replacements, and premature part failures that the average driver experiences over the lifetime of a vehicle is, in significant part, a consequence of the same incomplete combustion that a more efficient fuel formulation would eliminate. The mechanic, the parts manufacturer, the service center, and the fuel company are not separate industries with separate interests. They are components of a single integrated revenue structure, each one sustained by the inefficiency that sits at the center of it. The physics were never the obstacle. The physics have always pointed in the same direction. What has kept the standard fuel formulation unchanged for over a century is not a lack of scientific understanding. It is a very precise and very deliberate understanding of where the money goes when the combustion is incomplete. The forbidden vault opens. The story you have followed across 4 parts: the wasted fuel, the buried discovery, the corporate burial of a man's life work, the quiet adoption of his findings by industries powerful enough to use them privately, ends, as all such stories must, with a practical question. What do you actually do with this information? The answer is simpler, cheaper, and more accessible than anything the supplementary fuel additive industry would like you to believe. You do not need a branded product. You do not need a specialist supplier, an expensive treatment, or anything sold behind a counter by someone in a uniform. What Dr. Henkel identified as the active agent in his 1968 Tulsa experiments was acetone, a compound so common and so inexpensive that it sits on the shelves of hardware stores, pharmacies, and general retailers in almost every country on Earth. The specific requirement is that it must be labeled 100% pure acetone, with no additional solvents, fragrances, or carrier compounds mixed in. Nail polish remover, despite containing acetone, is not suitable. It contains water and other additives that will not benefit your engine and may introduce moisture into the fuel system. Pure acetone, sold as a solvent or cleaning agent, is what you're looking for. In most markets, a liter costs less than the price of a cup of coffee. The ratio is the most critical element of this entire process, and it is worth reading this section more than once before proceeding. The effective and safe concentration is 2 ounces of pure acetone per 10 gallons of petrol. In metric terms, this translates to approximately 60 milliliters per 40 liters of fuel. This is not an approximation to be adjusted upward based on the assumption that more will produce better results. It will not. Acetone at the correct concentration functions as a dispersant, breaking apart fuel molecule clusters and improving combustion efficiency. At concentrations significantly above the recommended ratio, it begins to affect fuel system components, particularly the rubber seals, gaskets, and fuel line materials used in modern vehicles, in ways that are counterproductive and potentially damaging. The ratio exists for a reason. Respect it precisely. The method of introduction matters as well. The correct procedure is to add the measured acetone to your fuel tank first, before filling with petrol. Pour the acetone in, then introduce the fuel on top of it. This sequencing ensures that the incoming petrol, under pressure and volume, mixes thoroughly with the acetone as it enters the tank, rather than sitting in separate layers. A thorough mix at the point of entry means the dispersant effect begins working through your fuel system from the first kilometer, rather than after partial consumption. This is a small detail, but in chemistry, small details produce measurable differences. For vehicles manufactured before 1990, the guidance is different and the caution is genuine. Older fuel systems were constructed with rubber components and seal materials that were not formulated with solvent-resistant compounds, because there was no commercial expectation that solvents would ever be introduced into civilian fuel. If you are driving a vehicle from that era, begin at half the standard ratio, 1 ounce per 10 gallons, and observe your fuel system for any signs of seal degradation or unusual fuel odor over the first 2 or 3 tanks. If no issues present, you may gradually move toward the full ratio. If anything appears abnormal, discontinue use. The formula was designed and validated on engine technology of its period, and older vehicles require a more conservative approach. What you should expect, if your vehicle is a modern one and the ratio is followed correctly, is a gradual rather than immediate change. The first tank will begin the process of dispersing accumulated carbon deposits from your combustion chamber and fuel injectors, deposits that have been building, in some cases, for years. This initial cleaning phase may temporarily produce slightly increased exhaust output as the accumulated residue is burned off. By the second or third tank, the combustion chamber will be operating with a cleaner surface, the fuel will be burning more completely, and your fuel consumption figures will begin to reflect the change. Most drivers who document the process report efficiency improvements of between 15% and 30% over 4 to 6 tanks, stabilizing at a consistent new baseline thereafter. 50 years ago, an engineer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sat in a laboratory and watched his instruments return numbers that should have changed the world. The corporations that had the most to lose from that change ensured that it reached almost no one. They had resources, legal infrastructure, institutional influence, and time on their side. What they did not account for, what no information suppression strategy ever fully accounts for, is the moment when the information escapes into the hands of enough ordinary people that it can no longer be contained. That moment is now a function of you, not in any dramatic sense, but in the most practical one possible. Every person who reads this and shares it is doing something the oil industry spent 50 years and considerable resources preventing, moving verified, actionable information from the margins into the mainstream. The industry buried a discovery. You have the ability to unbury it. Not through protest, not through confrontation, but simply by forwarding what you now know to the next person who deserves to know it. 50 years of silence. 50 people from you. That is the exchange.